Good afternoon and evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar this evening on restorative justice implementation, understanding school discipline data. My name is Dewana Nicole, and I'm with Advancement Project, and I'm joined today by Allison Meyer from Denver Public Schools. Say hi, Allison.
Hi, Dewana. Hi, everyone.
And also by Rob King from Advancement Project.
Hi, everyone.
So just as a reminder, these webinars are brought to you by the Restorative Justice Partnership. It's a coalition of community, labor, and school districts. The Advancement Project, National Education Association, Denver Public Schools, Denver Classroom Teachers Association, and Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, and we work to strengthen restorative justice implementation in Denver and throughout the country. And so this is one webinar in a series of webinars that we hold each month. This webinar is being recorded. We will have questions and answers at the end of the webinar. For those who are joining on the computer, you are able to type in your questions in the question box and in the chat. Unfortunately, for those who are joining by phone, who are just calling in, we are unable to see you, so we're unable to take your questions that way. However, you can email me your questions and we can still get them answered, or if you have my cell phone, you can also text me. And so in the spirit of restorative justice, we are actually going to open our webinar with a reading from Allison.
Sure. So this quote is from Stephen Levitt, who is co-author of the famous data-driven book, Freakonomics. Data, I think, is one of the most powerful mechanisms for telling stories. I can take a huge pile of data and I can try to get it to tell the stories. So I will get us started. Tonight's webinar is on understanding school discipline data, and I know a lot of you tuned in because you're really excited about the tool that Dewana mentioned that we have to share that Rob developed. But we're going to start talking a little bit about comprehensive data analysis. I think something that is sometimes overlooked when we think about understanding school discipline data is really thinking about how do we measure the shift in mindset that we want to see when we're implementing restorative justice school-wide. And so I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about how we can start to measure the impact of this work, and especially thinking about how intentional this work is and how often time-consuming it is. There are a lot of reasons why we need to be able to argue why we see that it's having an impact. And so grounding ourselves in our implementation guide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of data collection and analysis. And so in our implementation guide, it is benchmark 3, which is a method of collecting and analyzing data is developed that we're really focusing on tonight. And there's a lot of reasons why data collection is really important, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of those. And so first of all, for funding purposes, it's really important to have data to back up whatever it is that you're doing in your building. This is important both for grants and for private donations, but even here in Denver Public Schools, we find that it's really valuable internally as well, because the reality is that every year all of our different departments are fighting over scraps of a very small budget. And so being able to argue why restorative practices, why that budget needs to be sustained, or why that might even need to be increased from year to year, data is super supportive of that effort for us. I think data collection and analysis can also be really important for buy-in. So much of the work that is presented in our buildings to our educators now is data-driven. I would say pretty much the majority of it is. And so convincing people to adopt restorative practices and restorative justice in their classrooms, it's really important to be able to say this stuff works. And so I think that can be really valuable for teacher buy-in. I've also seen educators that are operating in schools where they might have a restorative classroom that isn't necessarily in a restorative school. Being able to collect data at the classroom level to then give it to administration can sometimes help inch people along and getting just closer and closer to having that restorative school. I think I've worked with some charter schools before that have been able to use data as a way to get buy-in from a charter network as well. And so oftentimes that sometimes is in contradiction between the charter restorative practices might be in contradiction to what the charter message is. And so I've worked with charter schools who have been able to use data collection as a way to really change the frame of the charter within they are operating. We'll talk a lot tonight about how data can be a tool for racial and social justice, and especially if the data is disaggregated in a meaningful way and in a timely manner. Data collection and analysis can also inform what training and support is needed in your school. I think about this a lot when we look at referral level data. If you have the same teacher referring students for a similar behavior repeatedly, it might mean that that teacher needs some support, and that might mean they need some support in de-escalation strategies or in designing their instruction in a more engaging way. It could also help indicate what overall staff trainings are needed. So maybe the whole staff needs implicit bias training. It can also help identify pockets of success. And I think this is something that we sometimes skip. We a lot of times use data to really identify where there are holes in our systems, but we also want to make sure that we are celebrating our educators and celebrating our schools when they are doing things right. And so using data to really identify who is doing things well. As many of you know, here in Denver, we host site visits at schools that are implementing restorative justice practices at a very high level, and a lot of those are very data driven. And so typically the principals from those schools come and share some of the data that they've seen in their building, and that right at the beginning of the visit, and that really helps people buy in to the fact that they're experiencing a model site. And finally, it's just best practices to make sure that we are informing our goals with data and also using data to measure progress on those goals for implementation. And so hopefully that just grounds us a little bit about what we'll be discussing today. And so I wanted to start by talking about what some of the common barriers to data collection and analysis we see around restorative justice practices and school discipline as a whole. And so the first one, which I know is going to be near and dear to everyone's hearts, is that the data is just not being inputted consistently. I was in a meeting recently in Denver Public Schools with a lot of the leaders of culture work in our buildings, and a colleague of mine shared the quote, "Data input is the greatest obstacle for data analysis." Meaning that so often we just are not actually entering the data that we need to be able to analyze. And so we'll be sharing tonight some strategies that you can use, and including an actual tool that you can use to help really streamline that data input so that you can get to that point of data analysis. I think back to so many schools that I've walked into where you see that stack of paper forms, and I think there are definitely some cases where paper forms might work better in a school environment, but making sure that those at some point get translated and entered into a space where they can be analyzed and turn into something meaningful and comprehensive for people to look at. The second common obstacle we see to data collection and analysis is that the data collected is not specific enough to identify needs and inform goals. I think the obvious example of this would be a school that isn't disaggregating their data, whether that be by race, by gender, by special education status, by the teacher that referred. Maybe they're only collecting data on the students and not also collecting which teachers are referring students for the discipline or the restorative process. I think some other examples that we might see, I've been in schools before where best intentions, they had a sign-in sheet for students when they arrived in the discipline office so they could track which students were in there throughout the day. But some of the things that they were missing is where were they coming from? Who sent them there? Were they self-referring or was a teacher referring? What time did they leave? So how much time were they actually spending out of class? And so really helping build out those systems and making sure your data is specific enough that you can use it to support and inform what you're doing in your building. One of the third common barriers that I see a lot in schools is that the data is being looked at too late. And this can kind of mean a couple different things. But the thing that really stands out to me is so often we wait until the end of the school year to really analyze our data. And so it might be at the end of the school year when the overall numbers and comparisons to last school year come out. And that's when we start to look at, for example, the disproportionality in our school discipline. And the reality is if we were looking at disproportionality on an ongoing basis, and like I said, there'll be a tool that will really help you facilitate this throughout the school year that we'll share at the end of the webinar. But if we're looking at an ongoing basis, we can actually take the steps earlier in the school year to correct some of that disproportionality that we might be seeing in our referrals. The other thing that I think of when I think of data being looked at too late is that we're looking too late down the referral process, or oftentimes down the school to prison pipeline. And so we might be looking at out of school suspension data when really we should also be looking at that classroom referral level data to understand what kids are eventually getting down that track where they've had so many strikes that they're put for out of school suspension. What teachers are calling out for help by referring their students out of the classroom on an ongoing basis. And so making sure that we're looking at the data in both a timely manner and also early enough in the process that we can catch some of these needs in our school community earlier on. And then finally, one of the other very common barriers that we see to data collection and analysis is that the only data being looked at is punitive discipline data. And this is something I'm very passionate about, that we also need to make sure that we're collecting the data of what's going well in our school. And I'll reference this a bit throughout our webinar, but I wanted to especially highlight how important it can be for staff buy-in to make sure you're collecting both punitive and discipline data. Coming from the classroom myself, and then also just being a part of a lot of professional development that's happening at the school level around school discipline data and data analysis, a lot of times I see that when teachers just see that suspensions are going down, that expulsions are going down, that referrals to law enforcement are going down, a lot of times for them, they just feel like a support has been taken away for them, and they're wondering what is happening in place of that. What meaningful work is happening to make sure we're building skills within our students and what supports exist for teachers to be able to address some conflict in their classroom or behavior concerns that they might have in their classroom. And so making sure we're not just showing the punitive data, but we're also showing that restorative data and what's really going well in our schools. And so I can give some examples to start of both punitive and restorative data that you might want to be collecting in your school. And so for punitive data, there's some obvious ones that really stand out to us. And so I think most schools, or a lot of schools are actually required to report this data to their state board of education, but are measuring expulsions, referrals to law enforcement, so times the police are called to your building, or times an incident in your building is referred to the police, and out of school suspensions. I think many of our schools are also reporting and collecting data around in-school suspensions. But where we kind of see some gaps in punitive data collection is next around in-school interventions. And so that could be maybe how many students are being sent to a lunch intervention or a lunch detention space. How many students are being held after school. Maybe you have a tardy detention or some sort of intervention that happens after school, and are we collecting and analyzing that data at the school level? Making sure that you're collecting data around referrals to the discipline office, and like I've already said multiple times, we'll have a tool that you can use to really help track that on an ongoing basis. Tracking the time that students are spent out of class. I've heard really powerful conversations happen in teacher team meetings around the number of minutes that a given student has spent outside of class in a week. And so you can imagine it's one thing to, for example, loop in a parent or loop in other supports within your school building and say something like, this student has been out of class a lot. It's quite a different conversation if you're able to say, for this student has missed 44 minutes of math time just this week. Due to some challenges that we've been having in the classroom. And that can really help target the supports that the teacher needs in that situation, and then also think about what skill building and support that student might need. Finally, I think we see not too many schools collecting this kind of data, but it could be really powerful if you have a school resource officer or a CSO or any sort of security officer inside your building, but being able to track as much as possible the interactions that students have with that figure in your building. We also want to make sure that any of our punitive data, and it'll be the same for our restorative data, is disaggregated. And some ways that you might break down this data so that it can be more meaningful and really inform your goals and your next steps for implementation would be by often what is referred to as offense, but I would say behavior, that is the reason for the referral or the suspension, by the educator who referred, Some other powerful indicators can be the location in the building where these things are happening. It might help you identify some areas where you need additional supports. And so if lunch is this space that is very chaotic and where you see a lot of referrals happening, how can you better support students and staff during lunch? Obviously, we want to see our discipline data, our punitive data broken down by race, by gender, by special education or English language learner status, by grade level, to really help target some of the interventions. Maybe it's the 7th grade teacher team that you notice is really struggling. Maybe it's the 7th grade students that need to have some more community building and relationship building. By date, I think we all know that there are those spikes at different times of year, but it's so much more powerful to actually have the data to back that up. And then finally, by time of day. I think for a lot of, for example, our elementary schools, we know that that period after recess can be really hard to get students regrounded and focused on their work. And again, it is just so much more powerful to be able to have the data to back that up rather than focusing on the gut feeling that we have as educators. In addition to that punitive data, what we really want to see is a collection of the restorative data. So if we see our suspension numbers going down, referrals going down, we want to make sure we can also say what is happening in replacement of those punitive strategies. And so some of the restorative data that you might consider collecting might be the percentage of incidents within your building or the percentage of referrals in your building that are addressed with a restorative resolution. You might want to address how much time was spent out of class. And so still, even when students are working through the restorative process, they might be pulled from a class period, and those minutes lost might feel a little different because those minutes lost are really when that student is having time to repair a relationship, to build a new skill, to have some understanding of their emotions and maybe do some regulation. But we also want to make sure that we're still noting that time that that student is missing out on content. You might want to track the resolutions themselves. I worked with a school recently who at their teacher meetings where they would discuss students of concerns, they wanted to start collecting data around which resolutions they used or which interventions they used for specific students. And then they wanted to be able to start mapping the success rate. And so, for example, they found themselves really relying on family meetings as a restorative resolution to conflict or behavior that was happening in their school. But what they found is when they eventually went back and started to look at the success rate, family meetings, when not supported by any other interventions, actually weren't that successful of a restorative intervention. And so really making sure you're documenting what resolutions were used so you can really understand were those resolutions successful. Some ways that you can kind of determine if those things were successful is by issuing surveys. And so maybe if there's a restorative conversation or a conflict circle that happens to address a certain behavior or conflict, making sure that you're following up with the parties involved about how that resolution felt for them. And so there are a couple different ways you can do that. You might want to do that immediately after to see how people are leaving the circle or leaving the conversation. It's also something that you might want to also revisit a couple weeks later. And so 2 weeks after the resolution, how are people feeling? Do they feel like the conflict was resolved? Do they feel like the community was repaired? School climate and culture data is incredibly valuable, and especially making sure that you get that climate and culture data from all stakeholders in a building. And so surveying staffs, students and families around school climate and culture, and we can always share some tools that you might use for that, around how frequently they are having restorative interactions or that they are seeing restorative practices being implemented in their schools. If you have a goal, for example, around implementing a stronger circle practice within your school, you might want to survey students on how often are they actually participating in a circle in a month, for example, of time at school. How often students are seeing proactive measures being implemented. Do they feel like there is concrete relationship building happening between them and their teachers? For teachers, you might want to survey, and even for students and their families, how confident they feel in their own skill set around restorative practices. You might survey teachers on how comfortable do you feel facilitating a restorative conversation between yourself and a student if you have a low level behavior that's happening inside of your classroom. And finally, one of my favorite things to survey around, and especially because I think it really indicates staff and student and family buy-in to restorative process, is how much they trust the restorative process. And so asking a question on a regular basis of, again, all three of those stakeholder groups, students, staff, and families. Do you trust the restorative process to resolve conflicts that you have? Do you trust the restorative process to resolve, to help build skill in your students in your classroom? I think one of the strongest indicators of whether or not a school is becoming more and more restorative can be our attendance data, as well as teacher and student retention from one year to the next. And so thinking about, are we measuring this in a meaningful way? For teacher retention, I've seen some schools be able to give me not only a percentage of teachers that are returning from the previous year, but also reasons why, which can be really powerful data to have. And so I work with one school in particular that has been able to report to me, we have 90% of our teachers returning next year. And that is a success in itself, but when they can also report to me that half of the teachers that are leaving because they are moving out of state, that makes that data even more powerful. And then finally, not to forget about our qualitative data in addition to our quantitative data. And so gathering as much as possible any stories that you can that might highlight growth and success within your building. And so that could look like a couple different things. Maybe you're hosting focus groups. Maybe anytime you have a really meaningful restorative conversation, or where you see a lot of growth from a student, being able to document that in a way that respects confidentiality, but also as a way that you can share this story in an ongoing basis. I can share something that we're doing here in Denver Public Schools is we've been working this year with a cohort of 15 schools, and we wrapped up our cohort by having each school share a success that they've experienced as a result of being in this cohort. And we're documenting them, and we're taking out student names and family names and school names, but just so we start to have this resource bank of really powerful work that's happening in our schools that we can cite later on, and especially when we start to see people not believing in the restorative process or not trusting that it might be able to be used in some really high need situations, but we'll have these case studies to be able to reference to say, actually, another school experienced this a couple years ago and they went this route, and that's how they were able to still be restorative in this situation. And so those are just some ideas of some of the data that you might be collecting in your school. And I'll kind of talk a little bit more later about how you might select your first couple years of really starting to collect this kind of data, how you'll select which of these data points you'll collect, because it can be really overwhelming at first to think about how am I going to find the time to collect all of these pieces of data starting next year. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is thinking about the steps to really implement this type of data collection and analysis. You really need to make sure that you have the right team assigned to be able to do this, and you have your roles and responsibilities of those team members really sorted out. And so when you're thinking about collecting this level of data, there's a couple questions you want to ask around roles and responsibilities. And so the first one would be, who in the school community will hold people accountable for data collection? Like I referenced before, that most common barrier is just that people are not entering the data. And so when it comes down to sit down and analyze it, you don't have the data even there. And so is there someone in your school community that can be that person that's really holding others accountable? It might be an administrator, so maybe it's the school principal that really is going to leverage their authority in the building to make sure that we're all collecting data. Just like we see with getting staff buy-in around restorative practices, it might actually be better to have some educators or some paraprofessionals that are really holding their peers accountable and explaining why it's so important to collect that data. Next, thinking about what is the expectation around data input for every stakeholder group in your building. And so classroom teachers might have one level of expectations, paraprofessionals might have another, the behavior team might have another. Just like with our students, we want to be really clear up front at the beginning of the school year, what is the expectation for data input and analysis? Who will analyze the data and how will it be presented? A lot of times we see that people on a behavior team, this responsibility often falls on them. Who among that team will really be the person analyzing the data? Because the reality is that if you don't analyze that data on an ongoing basis, you are going to lose buy-in from staff around entering that data in the first place. And then finally, thinking about how students and families can be involved in data collection and analysis. We talked about this a little bit in a previous webinar around authentically engaging our students and their families. But students and families can be a very powerful resource, and especially in the areas, in all areas, but especially in the areas where school staff feels spread very thin. It's a really great opportunity to engage young people and their families in that process. And so some things that come to mind to me and some things I've seen happening in schools is it would be great if students are actually out surveying other students around their experiences with the restorative process. As you can imagine, you might actually get different reactions if the survey is coming from a teacher or from school-based staff versus if it's coming from a peer. And same with families. Families might be out and surveying other families to really understand, how do you see the climate and culture of this school? They may be the ones to facilitate focus groups so that people feel like they can be more candid and honest in those spaces. Students can also do a lot of the analysis work within their classes. Data analysis translates really well to math classes and social studies classes, and so especially those secondary students. I've worked with a school who recently, they were fortunate enough that the Denver Public Schools data analysis system, there's a way to pull the data anonymously, and so it's not attached to student name, but it still has the student demographics. And they had a class of students that were analyzing the data to discover the disproportionality that was happening within their own building. And so you can imagine that that is powerful for multiple reasons. One, it is empowering our young people to really be able to look at that data and understand what it means. But two, it means that the young people are walking away with the understanding of the disproportionality that is happening in schools across the country and also in their own building. It's also really important at the beginning of the year to make sure that you establish the timelines for data collection as best as you can, knowing that you can always adjust as needed and as you get feedback from staff and students and families. And so thinking about if you are going to be administering surveys, when do you want to administer those surveys? So often we get to this time of year and there's a push to put out a bunch of surveys about a bunch of different indicators, and families are overwhelmed, and frequently this time of year people are starting to check out and you don't get the return in the number of surveys that you'd like to see. And so if you think at the beginning of the year about really strategically spacing out, when are we going to survey families and how frequently are we going to survey them? Thinking about when you're analyzing and reviewing data, which data points are really important to look at on a weekly basis. And so this might be looking at those minutes. How many minutes is a given student spending out of class? That's probably not as useful if you're only looking at it once a month. It's incredibly valuable data if you're looking at it on a weekly basis. Thinking about which teachers are referring. Okay, maybe that is something that you want to look for over a longer period of time. And so maybe which teacher is referring is something that you as a team are going to look at every other week or on a monthly basis. Thinking about which things can you put off to reviewing on a quarterly basis. Maybe that's when you do those school climate and culture surveys. Maybe that's something you want to review quarterly. And then finally, thinking about what are the benchmarks that you're going to space out throughout the year around maybe we need to, this is a checkpoint for this goal. We said we wanted more circles implemented across our school. So we're going to have a checkpoint in October. And depending on where we are at that checkpoint, we might adjust our goal accordingly. And so making sure you have those checkpoints in mind when you start. Otherwise, we frequently end up in May and we recognize we have never adjusted that goal to the reality of what we were seeing happen in our school over the course of the year. Obviously, since data input is such a challenge, we really want to talk about how can you gain staff buy-in to be able to input this data on a regular basis. And so a couple strategies that I've seen schools have a lot of success with are listed on this slide. So first of all, making sure that you have clear, measurable goals to which the data being inputted directly relates. And so ensuring that you are not collecting data around a data point that is never going to be given back to teachers or given back to students or given back to families. Making sure that people see the data that they're inputting that is oftentimes very time consuming to input actually being used. Along that same line, making sure that you then are sharing the data frequently. That encourages timely entry, and it also helps show progress on goals, and so people start to become more invested in entering that data. I've seen this happen I've seen schools kind of use this as a way to leverage staff buy-in in a couple different ways, but one that stands out in particular is thinking about if I share the data on an ongoing basis, or if I use that data on an ongoing basis, I can help staff really consider the the timeliness factor when they're entering data. And so I've worked with schools who, if you want to come to our weekly meeting about students of concern and bring up a student of concern, we definitely need that data already entered in the tracker that we use to discuss students of concern. And so I've seen schools kind of take that pause and say, I'm happy to support you in supporting this student or in honing your own skill set to be able to better support this student, but I need to make sure that you enter that data into our system so that it is something that we can track on an ongoing basis. Finding ways that you can incentivize data collection, that might be some basic bribery of awarding people with food and prizes, or maybe it's just a shout out to a teacher who's really done a great job around data collection. A lot of times our shout outs are around really strong instruction. Maybe we might do some shout outs for our colleagues around times they were picking up the slack of others around the building or supporting their colleagues in some of the work that they've been doing, but making sure that we are also acknowledging that data collection piece because it is some of the most powerful work that our educators do. It can be really powerful if you are able to set aside some time for data entry for your staff. I've worked in schools before where at the beginning of a team meeting, the first 15 minutes of that team meeting were designated just to catch up on data collection. And it was the data that was going directly to inform what the majority of that meeting was about. And so it also incentivized entering your data at an earlier time because it meant that you got a restroom break or you could go and get some coffee during those 15 minutes. But making sure that there is that designated time if you know that data collection in your school and the way you're analyzing data, it's probably taking an hour to 2 hours for each teacher a week. How can you build some of that time into your teachers' schedules? I think it can be really powerful to also make sure that staff, especially, but also students and families have a way to give feedback around the data that's being collected and the entry methods that are being used. And so making sure that teachers can help share, like this tool is actually really cumbersome for me, and it's not giving me the data that is actually useful for me when I reflect on my practice. It's also a great opportunity to help teachers really express, like, is there something really valuable that's happening in your classroom that the way that we're collecting data, it isn't being indicated? And that way you can really help leverage what is it that teachers want to share and what data can we collect around those points. Make sure that your meetings are structured in a way that they are informed by the data being entered. And so that translates beyond just maybe these designated data meetings that are happening once a quarter or once a month, but making sure that behavior team conversations, teacher team meetings, everything is informed with the data that people are expected to collect. And again, it just helps with that. If we continue to use the data, people are more likely to enter it. And then finally, as mentioned before, making sure that you have both that punitive and restorative data can be really powerful, and making sure that staff is bought in to entering this data. It just really helps that it doesn't feel as cumbersome, and especially if they're able to see the successes that the school is having and the impact that this work is having, it can definitely be more powerful for teachers and more. It can convince teachers, more persuasive for teachers to continue entering the data. Also make sure you're using the positive data and the restorative data. I think so often we tend to have most of our conversations, even in schools where they're collecting both, still most of the conversations kind of revolve around that punitive data, but make sure you're using that restorative data and that qualitative data to really share stories of success and reward what's happening around your building and reward staff and students and their families for the growth that you might see, because so frequently we see that people entering the restorative data really drops off because they don't see that data being used as much. And so the last thing I wanted to talk about before I hand this over to Dwana and Rob are some user-friendly tools that you might be able to use in your school to be able to collect data. And so I say, I'm going to mention these electronic surveys. One thing I want to note here is that being careful around confidentiality. And so Denver Public Schools, we're lucky to have a Denver Public Schools Google accounts. And so we've been given the okay to enter student names in those accounts. But keeping in mind that you might want to be wary of how much student information is entered into a Google document if you're kind of functioning on an unsecure network. And so it can be really powerful to be able to use electronic survey tools that will quickly analyze data for you. And so this can be really powerful for using, for analyzing those student, staff, and family surveys. I work with a lot of schools that also do their referrals this way. And so you fill out a Google form if you would like to make a referral to the office, and it automatically populates a spreadsheet that the behavior team can then analyze. One thing I would caveat that with, and especially when we're working with some of our families, is making sure that you also have paper copies of those surveys to make sure that the sample group is inclusive of families that might not have regular access to computers and to some of those electronic tools. The schools that I've seen be really successful have been able to replace whatever their existing paper referral system was, or even an electronic referral system was, with methods that already start that data entry process as soon as somebody has referred either themselves or a student for support. And so an example of that would be a school I was working with recently was using paper forms for referrals. And what that meant is it created an extra step for the person receiving those referrals to go and enter that into a database. When they replaced it with a Google form, it meant that before the student even got to the office or before the referral was either taken on by the dean in that building, there was already the beginning of data entry. And so the student had been referred, it had tracked who had entered the form, so they knew what staff member had put it in. The staff member had to put in time, date of what happened, and document what had started, and even document what interventions they had tried in the classroom. And so by the time it got referred to outside of the classroom, they had all of these data points already started, and then there were columns on that same spreadsheet that the dean then took over completing now that the student was referred. So anything you can do to really streamline that data entry process, I think forms like that can also help educators really be reflective on, what interventions did I try before I referred that student? And so I frequently have been in classrooms where an educator started to fill out one of those forms and then paused and went back and did an in-class intervention because they recognized, I think I'm just in a place today where my patience is a little thinner and there are still a couple of strategies that I can try within my classroom. I've seen past systems be used as a really interesting way to collect some data. And so I work with some schools that use buddy teachers as a place for students to refocus. And so when they send the student with a kind of refocus guidelines or a refocus form to the other teacher, they'll note the time and on the reflection form, and the student uses that as their pass to the buddy teacher. And when they are ready to return to their classroom environment, the buddy teacher notes what time the student returned, and then they head back to their classroom teacher. And so just by using this pass system, they're able to document how many minutes students spent outside of the classroom refocusing in another teacher's room. While teachers are in school, I think we're seeing a lot of increased access to technology in some of our buildings. Some schools are lucky enough to have one-to-one technology. Some schools are starting to utilize the fact that a lot of students have cell phones more often in their schools. And so thinking about how can you use that as a way to really have more frequent data collection happening inside of your building. And so one school that I work with has been using their newly adapted one-to-one technology model where all students have a tablet computer as a way to check in with students on a daily basis. And so students check in and report how they are feeling that day. And while that data is currently just used to kind of have that who needs to go out and support which students really need our support in having a good day, which students are having a great day that we want to talk to about what strategies they use to get there. I think that data could also be used on a larger scale to talk about here where we see those peaks of our students really struggling. You know, we all have that gut feeling that Mondays are hard, but where can we have that documentation that Mondays are hard for our students and they're typically coming in feeling at a 4 versus on Tuesdays when we see an average of a 6. And so being able to really break down those daily check-ins and analyze them in a more comprehensive way. And then finally, like I said, we crave the stories that come along with this data. I think sometimes for some people, data analysis can feel really dry. And so making sure that you're also doing some focus groups and some interviews, and you have some other ways to really catch the richness of those stories. Like I said, here in DPS, we're using a case study model right now where we're trying to get our different schools that have been invested in this work for this school year and are at the early stages of implementation to really note those success stories and where they've seen growth so that we can start sharing those rich stories with other schools. And so with that, I will pass it over to Dwana.
Thank you, Allison. And so even though these webinars are really rooted in restorative justice implementation, we know that data is something that is beneficial for every single school. When we created the implementation guide, one of the reasons we went through a lot of back and forth about, so what are we going to recommend that schools collect? And we knew that not every school collects data in the way that we were suggesting, but we wanted to think about what the type of data that we knew was necessary, that we knew could be helpful to really understanding what is happening within the school. And so we had some very aspirational goals, but what we also learned is that there are school systems that collect data in the way that we know is going to be very helpful. And so when data wasn't readily available, one of the things that we've always encouraged people to do is to use the civil rights data collection data, which provides a national picture, a picture of your school district, and then also of your individual school. So young people, families, staff actually know and understand what is going on in the school. And so last month, we got the 2015-16 school year data release. And what we saw is that we are still suspending, over 2.7 million young people each year. The disparity still exists for Black children especially, and young people with disabilities. The disparities have actually grown over time. So as we shrink our overall numbers, our disparities actually widen. And then we see those same disparities when it comes to law enforcement, referrals, and school-based arrests. And although the CRDC data is incredibly helpful, it does give us a picture of what is going on in our school communities if we don't know, because we do know that the data sharing to communities is often lacking. There are some school districts that do a great job of sharing their data on an annual basis. And obviously you can always request that data, but there are some that don't, where the data isn't readily available. And so in the communities that we were working in, really making sure that young people and their families had access to the data. And so using the CRDC was a really helpful tool. However, there were still a couple of challenges and gaps there. One is that the data only comes out every 2 years. And when it's released, it's already 2 years old. So last month, we got the data for 2015-16, and though in many cases, some of that data currently is very similar, this doesn't give us a current picture of what is happening within our school buildings right now. It also doesn't show referral data, some of the data that Allison was mentioning earlier, where we also know that the greatest disparities actually exist. And so when we look at the young people who are actually suspended, there are many more that are referred that we're losing in the CRDC data because we don't count referrals. And so we're very fortunate enough to have someone on staff who works with data, who was able to kind of take that idea about understanding and wanting to analyze data in real time and create a tool that will allow for some of our school communities to do that work. And so with that, I'm actually going to pass this webinar on to Rob King from Advancement Project, who is going to talk about how to use discipline data and analyze it in real time.
Thanks, Allison and Dewana. So as Dewana said, the CRDC provides a lot of great information. However, it often provides this data years after it has been collected. So that's not really beneficial when you want to understand the current dynamics in your school. So our hope is that this student referral collection and assessment tool will help you kind of analyze that referral and incident data in real time so that you can create and present timely solutions. And so the assessment tool provides three things, I think. One, it provides a template for collecting the data on student referrals. So what is the actual information you should be recording, like the things that Allison mentioned earlier in the webinar. And then two, it provides tables that give you automatic disaggregation of the data for easy assessment. So if I want to look at how many Black girls in the 9th grade received out-of-school suspension for a school year, I can use the tables provided in this tool to get that information, right? The third thing is that it has pre-programmed formulas to assess either risk for discipline or counts of discipline per 100. And when I say discipline, I'm referring to in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, and arrest. And so there's a difference between risk for discipline and counts of discipline per 100. to explain that, I'll use this example. So say you have school A, which has 300 cases of in-school suspension or ISS, but only 270 students actually received ISS throughout the school year. So you have some students who received ISS more than once. And so if you want to look at risk for discipline, you would be focusing on those 270 students. You would be counting how many times a student appeared at least one time within the data, right? If you're interested in counts of discipline per 100, you would be looking at the 300 cases of ISS. And so you might have a student who appears more than once within those 300 cases, but you're not concerned with that. You're just concerned with the actual discipline that was meted out, right? And so the assessment tool provides you the ability to look at both of those numbers. And so some of the data that we suggest that you should collect within this assessment tool includes the school year, the school name, the student ID, some unique identification number that identifies each student, the date of the incident that caused the referral, the time of the incident, location of the incident, the individual referring the student, so that could be the teacher, the vice principal, some other staff member, the student's grade level, the student's race, ethnicity, the student's gender, the student's disability status, the student's offense. And so we're defining that as the actual action that occurred. So whether or not it was the student's behavior, or maybe the student got into a fight, something of that nature. And then the student's outcome. So what is the outcome the student received? So was that ISS, out of school suspension, referral to police, an arrest, or it could have been some form of a restorative justice practice. And then we also include a category for total instructional days lost. So how many days of instruction were lost for the student due to the outcome that they received. And so for those who are online, we have a quick video that will kind of show you how it will actually work. And so, like I said, once a referral takes place, whoever is collecting that information will be able to type this in to the document, the school name, the student ID, location, time, demographics concerning the student, or pertaining to the student rather. And this would be logged into the discipline log. And then after all that information is logged into the discipline log, you could move over into what we call the council referral sheet, which would automatically populate all the information that you put into the discipline log into these tables. And so then you can go down into the table and start to look at specific information from school to grade to gender to disability status to outcome. And so there are tabs that you can click on. And so say I want to look at students in Memorial High School, right? I can click Memorial High School and say I want to look at female students within Memorial High School. I can also select that as well. And the table below begins to provide me with information on the amount of students by race and the total days lost. Then I can move over to the counts of students, which provides the same information for me, right? So I can begin to look at the specific school I want to look at, the grade level, the gender, disability status, outcome, and then all the numbers and relevant information by race are presented for the total number of students and the total days lost, right? And so again, going back to the risk for discipline and the counts per 100. And so when you're looking at counts of referral, that'll be talking strictly about the number of discipline meted out over the school year. When we're looking at counts of students, that's strictly talking about the number of students who received at least one form of discipline throughout the school year. And so what's not shown within the actual video right here is that within the counts of referrals and within the counts of students sheets, below the tables is a chart where you can plug in numbers that allows you to actually get the percentage for both of those categories. And I will turn it back over to Allison and Dewana.
Thank you so much for that, Rob. And so following the webinar, tomorrow morning, we will send out a recording of the webinar and the data tool. And so as Rob was saying, you can do that by school. You can also look at data in real time by school district. And so the school district can collect that data from multiple schools. The individual schools can collect that data from multiple students. And that is a really great way to let you know what your data is in real time, what the disparities are in real time, and what's the lost days of instruction all in real time. And so now we are going to take some questions and answers. As a reminder, if you are on your computer or your smartphone, you can type in your question and answers in the question and answer box. If you are calling in and you're just on your cell phone and you do not have the ability to do that, you can send me an email or you can send me a text message, and we can answer your question that way. And so we have a few questions already. Are there confidentiality issues around the use of Google Forms? We were trying to use for IEP purposes, and we were getting pushback about having student names on Google files. Allison, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So in general, I would say yes. And so making sure we worked with our technology department here at Denver Public Schools before we were given permission to be able to use Google Documents. For quite some time, we were told that there was not enough protection for students, particularly when entering student names. And so it wasn't until just this year where DPS schools were given permission to use Google Docs. And so I'm not tech savvy enough to know exactly what those security measures that were taken were. But I do know that if you're just using like a personal account or even a school district based account that doesn't have the proper security features, there could be issues with confidentiality.
Rob, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Allison is spot on. I am always hesitant to use online forms unless there's clear security measures in place.
So our next question is about the civil rights data collection, asking if the departments are still functioning under this current administration in the Justice Department, the Department of Education. And so the answer to that is yes, there is still an office in both Departments of Education and Justice. The data was released. For those of you online who have been working or paying attention to this issue, especially this year, there has been some concern, some ongoing concern that there would be some rollback of the school discipline guidance that was released in 2014 that really talked about, some of the importance of this work, that highlighted some of the harms with exclusionary discipline, and that we really used in order to move school districts forward in a way. So currently, those departments still do exist. If other folks want to weigh in about, the effectiveness of those departments under that administration, I think that is something that we continue to monitor, especially in light of some of the federal guidance that we have seen kind of roll back within this current administration. So our next question, are there specific examples related to tracking restorative practices? I would love to know more about how you decide what to track based on your experience. So Allison, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it's just making sure that whatever you're tracking very closely relates to a goal that is very public among your staff and students and families. And so I've worked with some schools who their goal is strictly around implementing more community building circles around the school. And so then the data that they're collecting around restorative justice practices is very closely tied to that goal. And so they might be surveying teachers around their confidence in their skill set in leading restorative community building circles. They might be surveying students and how often they're actually experiencing that around their school building, just as a way to kind of double check that data and seeing, like, is this actually happening in buildings? And I think it's really important to have both perspectives. Both is the teacher feeling as if they are using some of these relationship building strategies, and as the student actually experiencing the impact of those relationship building strategies in the classroom. Some other examples I've seen are data collection forms that might look kind of similar to the tool that Rob shared with us around punitive discipline, but thinking about which student is coming in. Were they self-referred, or were they referred by a staff member? In our schools where we see a lot of self-referrals, that is really powerful data to say that like 75% of the students in the school community are coming and engaging in the restorative process with their own self referring them, or a peer referring them to the process, because they really want a space to be able to, work out low-level conflicts before they turn into something bigger. And so I know that's been some really powerful data for some schools to collect. I think it's also just useful for making sure that the restorative process is implemented with fidelity. And so some schools are collecting data around what restorative interventions or what agreements are coming out of a harm circle or a restorative conversation, also as a way to make sure that somebody in the school building is kind of assigned to making sure that those things actually happen. And so if two students are agreeing to have lunch together for the next week to start to build a relationship with each other after a misunderstanding, then who in the school staff is actually going around and following up with that? And so then being able to report that not only were this percentage of our conflicts in the building handled with a restorative resolution, but we also saw that of those restorative resolutions, 90% of them were upheld and were effective. And so those are some initial examples that kind of come to mind. But again, I would make sure that whatever data points you're collecting are really closely tied to some school goals that you have. So it just doesn't feel like this arbitrary data input for members of your school staff.
Great. And so our next, we have a comment or just a suggestion with regards to using Google to collect data. So definitely advising folks to speak with their school district personnel, because every school district is different. So just because it's allowed in some districts doesn't mean it's allowed in others. So that would also be a really great conversation to have with personnel to make sure that you are not violating any privacy laws. Okay, so this is for both of you. So how do you control the fidelity of the data entered? For example, do you recommend that only a few number of trained staff enter the data to ensure that the data is entered with consistency?
So it kind of depends on the data we're collecting. In DPS, there is a designated person in every building in Denver Public Schools that is designated as the building discipline leader. And that person is responsible for the data that's collected around referrals, suspensions, expulsions, things of that nature in all of the school buildings. And so it might mean that they delegate some of that work out, but ultimately there is one person in the building that's really responsible for that data collection. I would say, thinking about like the restorative data that we're collecting, which isn't necessarily something that needs to be reported to the state or reported to the district, I think there's more flexibility there. And what I see being the most successful there is just having the person who's most highly impacted by that data being the person that enters it. And so the person that we have the luxury of a position in DPS that's a restorative practices building coordinator. And so that person would definitely be the lead on collecting a lot of that work and entering that data into a system so that it's being entered consistently. I've worked with some schools where they're doing surveys at the classroom level once a month around students and how they feel, and do they do they feel safe in their school, and do they have people that they can talk to? And they actually intentionally have the teacher be the person that takes those paper surveys and enters them into the computer system, because the reality is that ensures that the teacher is reading and reflecting on the feedback that their students have given. So I think that can be a really good strategy when you start to get to these, I guess, the data points that don't necessarily need to be reported to a state, or that aren't really integral for those like disproportionality pieces, where you can really just have the person who's the most highly impacted by the data that's being collected be the person that's entering it.
Yeah, I would agree. When you're dealing with strictly quantitative data, I think it's best to have either one person or a group of people who are strictly there to do that work. But when you're dealing with qualitative data, and the kind of information or focus group type of things, it's okay to have that a little bit more spread out for everybody to kind of take a part in. Like Allison mentioned, especially if you have specific goals that you want to accomplish using that qualitative data.
Great. So the next question, so for school districts not already collecting school discipline data, what is the first step towards encouraging them to start doing so, and how can parents have an influence? So first, all school districts are required to report and collect suspension, expulsion, school-based arrest data. I think the question around whether or not they actually, that data is readily available to the public is another thing. So some school districts do a good job of the annual reporting of the data, others not so much, but they are required by law to report that to the state that has to report it to the federal government. And so I don't know, Allison and Rob, if you all want to share any advice that you have for families where maybe they don't have that data isn't readily accessible to them. What is some advocacy that they can do within their school districts and or school buildings to get a hold of that data?
Here in Denver, the community organization Padres y Jóvenes Unidos has been a very powerful accountability partner for Denver public schools. And one method that they have used time and time again and continue to use now as a way to hold the district accountable is frequently attending school board meetings and presenting at school board meetings the data points that they would like to see. I think sometimes that can be a way to really reach elected officials who want the votes and the input from families as saying, like, this is what we need as a community to be able to hold this district accountable, and in order to know that this district is putting the needs of our students first.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would also say to first find out if there's a group doing work around this, like Padres is doing in Denver, so that you can join in with them. And if that doesn't exist, trying to find other parents, other concerned community members that you can take with you to those school board meetings, so that you have not just one individual, but a group of individuals who can push for that.
Thank you. So I hope I'm going to say this correctly. Have either of you used Power BI and or Tableau? I know Rob has for displaying entering data.
Yes, Tableau is a great tool to use. The only thing about it, as far as my knowledge of it at this point, is that you need to have a clean data set to work with in order to input that information and get those clean visualizations out that you want, right? And so that is the biggest hurdle, is making sure that you get that clean data set.
Allison, have you used either one of those programs?
I have not, but I just wrote them down.
Okay. Okay. I love the idea of creating a case study bank. Do you provide teachers or staff with a template for recording qualitative data or anecdotal evidence and stories of particularly effective restorative interventions?
Sure. So this is actually the first time we've done it. We just started piloting this about a week ago. But what we're toying around with right now is actually using the typical questions of a restorative conversation as the outline for how we're collecting those stories. And the stories can either be around a specific incident that happened in the school that was handled in a really impactful restorative way, or they could also be around a system that the school is implementing as a way to respond to a concern that they were seeing in their building. And so simply we ask, we're framing it as, we're trying to make them as short as possible so people will actually read them. But we frame it as first by starting by listing off the school demographics. So how big is the school? What grade levels does it serve? What's the student breakdown as far as free and reduced lunch, and along racial demographics? And that is intentionally to push back on the school buildings that sometimes say, well, that works in that school, but there's no way that will work in my school. And so to be able to say, well, the school has a very similar demographic as your school. And it did work there. We also try to connect it to one of the benchmarks that are found in our implementation guide. So is the school showing strength in collecting and analyzing data? Are they showing strength in the way that they're engaging their young people and their families? And then finally, we ask 4 questions. So what happened? And that might be a specific incident or the conditions that were happening in your school building that were an obstacle to restorative practices implementation. Who was being impacted by this? And so again, it could be the specific students or community stakeholders that were impacted by an incident. It might also be who was being impacted by this gap in data collection, or who was being impacted by this clear loss in staff buy-in. The next question is, how did your school community take responsibility? And so thinking about like who in your school community identified the problem and proposed the solution, or it might be around the specific incident, who took accountability for the role they played in that specific incident. And then finally, how did your school community fix this? And so if there was a tool that was developed, a new system, a trainer that came in, and that also might be about if it was a specific incident, what were the agreements that came out of the circle that was used to address it. And so I can share with Dwana a PDF version of the document that we're using to grab the note to catch the notes for people who, as they want to share these successes, so that it's something that other schools might use as well.
Perfect. So is there a place where some of these surveys are housed that we're speaking of? Assuming, and I could be wrong, that we're talking about some of those qualitative surveys, and there is definitely a place. We can send out the link to a compendium of surveys that folks can go through and use. We always suggest that you identify a survey that's really going to fit your school community and ask some of the questions that you want answered in your school community. So there's a list of several that we can also send out following this webinar, so you can go on and peruse them, and then we can also suggest some that we've used in the past if you're struggling with identifying one for yourself. This webinar will be shared after we finish today, a recording of the webinar, and all of the information that we have mentioned today, including our data tool and the summary of the 2015-16 CRDC data, a one-pager that we have about analyzing data as it relates to restorative justice, and a really great article that Rob helped co-author about understanding data as well. So next question, are there any successful practices of having students assess data and set goals with adults on school discipline? If so, how do you do that while protecting confidentiality?
So the school that I've worked with that has a lot of student involvement in data input and analysis, they have been able to pull data without student names or ID numbers attached to them. I'm not entirely sure how they did that, but they made sure that students were analyzing data and still had the demographics of students, but did not have individual student names. It also might speak to the size of the school that they were able to do that without compromising the confidentiality.
And Rob, did you have any advice on how this could be done and using data as an advocacy tool while respecting the confidentiality and the privacy of young people?
Yeah, I'm not completely sure how most school systems do this, but if they're using data system of some kind, there's students usually have like a unique ID number that is hard to attach to them for any normal person to just walk in and try to figure out which student it is. Looking at that unique ID, they wouldn't be able to do that. And so using those unique ID numbers, you can usually parse out that information that you want to get while still making sure that you hold confidentiality.
Perfect. And so if there are any other questions, you can feel free to type them now. Otherwise, I forgot to mention this, the question that was asked about, who in the building should be analyzing data. And so one of the recent webinars that we did was on creating and sustaining effective school behavior teams. So that's always a place where we certainly suggest that team be a group of people who continuously look at data and examine data so they have that current picture of what is going on in the school building. And so as you're thinking about people in your school community who, may be the folks who enter this data and analyze this data on a regular basis, that would be one team to think about, or one set of people to think about. And when we send the recording of this webinar, we will also send a link to the other webinars that we have been having this school year. And so I don't see any other questions. And so, Allison, I don't know if you have a closing.
I do.
Okay.
So this quote is from Susan Ettlinger. Data doesn't create meaning, humans do. As my high school algebra teacher used to say, show your math, because if I don't know what steps you took, I don't know what steps you didn't take. And if I don't know what questions you asked, I don't know what questions you didn't ask. And it means asking yourselves really the hardest question of all. Did the data really show this, or does the result make us feel more successful and more comfortable?
So thank you all so much for joining us this evening. A special thanks to Allison and Rob for sharing so much information, all the great work that Rob did in putting this data tool together. I'm very excited about it and how schools and school districts will be able to use this and really calculate their data and analyze their data in real time. We'll also send Rob, if this is okay with you, Rob's contact information in case you ever want to talk to him about how, creative ways to use data in your school community. I know hopefully he will be interested in that. No pressure though, Rob.
Yes, happy to.
And so thank you again for joining us tonight. Again, tomorrow we will send out the recording of this webinar along with tons of information for you to use. And as always, a lot of these webinars that we do are in response to questions that we get on an ongoing basis. And so if there's something that you think would be helpful, if there's something that you think you need, chances are we either have it already or it's in the works, so we'd be more than happy to develop it for you. Our next webinar will be next month, where we will actually have a principal from one of the restorative schools in Denver who will be talking to us about how a building leader can really create and work towards a restorative culture in their school building. So thank you all again for being with us, and we will talk to you next time.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.